This is the Behavioral Divide, brought to you by Avantis Investors, where we bring together both academic research and real-world financial advice to uncover insights that may help us make better financial decisions. I am Jeremy Thornton, Senior Investment Director with Avantis, here with our host, Professor Hal Hershfield. So Hal, I caught another really great interview, this time on personality types and how that may influence our financial decisions. To start, why don't you just talk to us a little bit about your takeaways from the interview?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Right. So today, another good group of folks to talk to. On the advisor side, we had Brandon Ratzlaff, who's a director at Cypress Point Wealth Management, also a newly minted Ph.D. himself. And then on the academic side, we had Joe Gladstone. He's an assistant professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder's Leeds School of Business, and he's also an incoming professor at Rady. That's at UC San Diego's business school. And one last thing I'll say about him, he's the co-director of the Center for Research on Consumer Financial Decision-Making at Boulder. And, today we're really talking about how our personality types and tendencies have this sort of intersection with the decisions that we might make and how we receive messages. For me, two big things stood out. Joe's got he's just got some incredible research, right? He works with these huge data sets. He uses machine learning algorithms. And, one of the things he does is say, okay, what sort of messages work well for different groups of people? Another thing he does, he almost flips it around and says, how can we actually infer who you are based on how you spend money? And, not only do we uncover some of these insights and dig into them, but I really loved how Brandon would hear what Joe was saying and say, all right, well, some of this stuff we might try to do on a human level, but we're also a little bit far away from being able to actually do this at scale. Right. And so I think more than any of the other conversations we had, this discussion really focused on the promise of marrying big data analyses and some of these academic insights with the types of data that financial advisory firms can get to help advisors and the firms themselves speak better to different groups of people, and not necessarily in Joe's terms have one size fit all messaging. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I'm curious your take, is, Brandon pointed out at the very end, we're talking about personalities as if they're singular, but we often deal with couples, and how does that matter, right? And so I'll leave it to the conversation to uncover that one. But let me turn it to you.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I'd add that, there was maybe some things I felt like I learned about myself through this it didn't really occur to me that my own personality might play into how I make decisions with my money. I recognize in myself that I tend to be highly agreeable. And so that's caused me to reflect a little bit on what does that mean for me and what I'm doing with my money. So I sort of enjoyed just the self-reflection that brought on. Some other really interesting things about, how we might be able to infer something about me if you look at my my credit card statement. So I think people will enjoy kind of hearing a little bit about that. But ultimately, I thought it was one of the best discussions we've had, really digging into why we did this podcast. It's really kind of digging into, where do we overlap and not overlap? We're sort of straight away from one another when we think about the research and the practical application from the advisor community. So I really loved how we dug into some of that in this episode, and I think people will really enjoy it.
All right, let's do it.
Yeah, let's go to the episode.
Brandon, Joe, really excited to have this conversation with you guys. I think personality is just a fascinating topic, and I know it's one of those ones that everybody wants to know about because we want to know, what sort of personality am I, and I mean, is there anything more popular than like which Harry Potter character are you, or which Sex and the City character are you online, right? And of course, today we're going to be talking about how the personality traits and tendencies that I think we have intersect with the financial decisions we make, and also intersect with the ways that messaging might be received, or I might say rejected. Joe, you've done some just really, really cool research in this space, and to the to those of you watching and listening, the statistical techniques, Joe, that you've used are just super cutting edge. And so I think it'll be really interesting to hear your position on some of these questions. And then Brandon, I'm going to really enjoy hearing your take on this as well, and where you see personality fit into the types of interactions and decisions that you have with your clients. So Joe, let me kick it off, and I'm going to ask you the most basic of questions, which I'm sure we could spend hours on, but I'll ask you not to. Um, what do we even mean when we say personality?
Yes, happy to answer that. So personality just means what makes us different to each other. And we know we're different from each other because we've all had a difficult boss or an argument with a romantic partner or whatever. And we realize, how could they think like that? Like, how could they see the world that way? And it's just very obvious that we're very different from each other, but we're not different in totally random ways. We're different in ways that have patterns to them. There are clusters of the type of person someone is, or kind of traits that someone has. And some of these are really obviously related to finances and some less so. The fact that some people are organized, disciplined, think far into the future, and that's something that's like a pattern, trait, means that those people tend to be better with finances. But there are also traits that we might not expect to be related to finances that also matter as well.
That is a great and very succinct explanation. I really appreciate that. And so just before I go to Brandon, Joe, let me just ask you a question here, which is, you really kicked it off by saying, like, it's not just the sort of standard things that we think about when we think about personality. I know people think about, well, I'm extroverted or introverted or open to new experiences. You have a really, I think, important paper on a personality dimension that we might not think about much, but is super relevant to this current moment in time, which is optimism. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how your research has found that optimism might translate into everyday saving behaviors.
Yeah, so I published this big paper this year about optimism and savings. And basically, it's kind of not immediately obvious who you would expect to save more. People who think that everything is going to turn out rosy and beautiful and wonderful in life, and those who are skeptical and worried and nervous and anxious. Like, if you imagine two friends that describe those two people, like, who would you expect to save more? And I think you could come up with arguments either way, that the person who thinks about all the bad things that are going to happen, the health crises, the losing their job, surely they should save more because they're worried about what's going to happen, versus the person who's optimistic and think everything's going to work out. Wouldn't they be laissez-faire and not need to? So just, at a very high level, we find a very strong, incredibly consistent relationship that people who are more optimistic tend to save and invest more and accumulate more wealth over their lifetime. So in that first initial question, it's the optimists who win out. And I think this is actually often something that, financial advisors, it's a message consistent with what they say, that, probably people are underinvested in the market. They probably aren't, and they also don't save enough. And so, you should be optimistic about the future, both in terms of like the economic future that would make you save more, but also what I'm measuring is just people's general in life, how optimistic are they? And by that, I mean, how likely do you think that things in the future will be positive versus negative, basically?
Okay, and so Brandon, I mean, I'm assuming you're hearing this, and I'm part of what I'm wondering is, like, how much does this map on those findings? Does that map on to your experience? In other words, when you look at the clients that you've worked with, how do their general outlooks, whether it's optimistic or pessimistic, how does that show up in terms of their decisions, the way that they approach saving and investing for the future?
Yeah, well, I think if you work with enough clients over enough period of time, you're going to find actually some that support Joe's research and some that don't. As Joe's saying that, we definitely think about, I think on the professional side, the advisor side, we certainly think about things kind of binary as optimistic or pessimistic, just very generalized labels. And I would say that in most cases, the optimistic client does have a longer futuristic perspective that allows them to make better financial decisions, and save more is part of that, right? Savings is part of the good financial behavior. But I also can think of I can think of lots of clients that I've worked with through the years that actually were maybe a little more pessimistic, and that resulted in actual saving behavior because and I've kind of created this term, and I don't know how much validity there is to it, but I'm going to call it dopamine fog, where the optimistic person is so excited about their successes that they've had, whatever is creating the optimism, that they think tomorrow is always going to be there. And so they will actually delay some good financial behaviors because there's tomorrow. So, but I would say generally, I think Joe's research is consistent with what you would find if you polled most financial advisors. But certainly I can think of a handful of client relationships that the pessimistic personality has actually led to better financial behaviors.
Joe, I'm curious your take on this, because of course, I think Brandon's drilling down on something that is, true for many papers, which is that we can see a tendency, and that doesn't mean that tendency applies to you or to everybody, right? And I know that you're saying sort of in general, this is the case, but he's also, Brandon, you're also talking about something really important, which is this sort of our tendency to kind of make a personality spectrum into a binary outcome. Like you're either optimistic or you're pessimistic. And then, Joe, I know that's not what your research is saying, but I'm wondering if you could just respond to this a little bit, Joe, and say like, well, to what extent is what Brandon is observing, to what extent do you pick up on any of that in your data?
Yeah, I mean, we're always talking about average effects, right? So I'm saying that for the, if you take, I've got 140,000 people in the study, like, if you take the average person, if they're more optimistic, holding everything else constant, holding, their overall wealth constant, their education, everything else, then we see this relationship that if they're more optimistic, they tend to have more in assets and savings. One important part of the paper is that we actually find optimism, it seems to matter a lot more for people on the lower end of the income and wealth distribution. So it seems like for people who are faced with like challenges in terms of their financial lives, that actually being optimistic seems to have a bigger boost to their savings than people further up the income and wealth distribution. And so you could imagine that given that many financial advisors are dealing with people in the upper deciles of the income and wealth distribution, that, yeah, there might be a less strong relationship at that very top end. So basically, I think it's important to recognize that these are average effects, but also that these effects are not the same for everyone. Like that basically this effect seems to be stronger for people who are poorer.
So Joe, can I ask a question just to kind of drill down on this a little bit? So you mentioned that optimism, there's a stronger relationship based on socioeconomic status or, where they stand financially. You also talked, or just in the intro really, about these clusters of personalities. Like, can you find other traits that like offset pessimism? Like, could the client that I'm referring to be so organized and futuristic, but kind of, but also like a little pessimistic about the world today and still be successful? Like, can other personality traits offset a pessimistic personality trait?
Absolutely, definitely. Like, so what we're trying to do most of the time is really isolate like one factor that's affecting some outcome. And so I'm saying that optimism matters, even controlling for like other personality traits or self-control, but it's definitely not the case that it matters in a way that excludes those things. So if you had someone who was, highly self-controlled and disciplined and had great training in like what they should be doing with their money, like those things are going to matter more than them being a pessimist. But all else being equal, it seems like the optimistic person saves more.
I find all this really interesting because, again, I think we typically consider personality to be some of the stuff that we've heard about. If anybody's ever taken Psych 1, you consider the big 5 personality traits. And this is a really interesting trait. And Brandon's, optimism that is. And Brandon, your point here is like, how does this intersect with other traits? And I think one of the questions that arises when I think about this stuff is, okay, well, what do we do about this? And in other words, how might an advisor actually learn from this? How might an advisor actually know something about someone's personality traits, short of, say, giving them a survey? And maybe that is a tool, right? But I wanted to actually use that as an opportunity to talk about some of your other work, Joe, and Brandon, I'll really be interested to see how you react to this. Joe, you've got this work showing that you can actually infer personality from spending patterns, right? Which of course I know, as I read that work, my immediate thought was like, oh my God, like what is my credit card showing, to me? I mean, and this seems so private in a way, right? So I'm curious, like talk to me a little bit about that work. And then I want to know about like, how might advisors use this knowledge responsibly? And then I'll go to you, Brandon, and see if you can show me your credit card statement so we know about your personality, of course, too.
Thanks, Hal. Yeah, this is probably some of the work that I'm most proud of and found the most fascinating to do. So, I mean, as we go about life, we leave behind these like breadcrumbs about ourselves, these digital footprints, as we go on social media and tweet stuff, as we, search online, the cookies we leave behind on the internet. And one type of thing that we leave behind is these digital traces from what we buy. And what we can do is that is telling me something about who you are. Like maybe not the fact that you spend 5% of your income on takeout, Hal, but the fact that you bought takeout on a Thursday night, at 7 p.m. and then the same thing on the Friday, and the same thing on the Saturday. It's transaction data, your spending data is incredibly rich and detailed, incredible, because it's not just that you spend money on this category. It's the time and the place and the zip code it's attached to, and and you can make inferences about who they're with and all these things like that. So, basically, people's transaction data is incredibly rich, and we can use that to predict people's personality. And so the way I did this is I worked with a fintech app who are an aggregator app. So they pull in all of your transactions across all your different accounts, all your credit cards, and then we ran a large-scale personality survey of these people. And then we used their survey and we ran some machine learning models to predict their personality from their transactions. Now, like the magic here, the thing that makes this really cool and to me sexy and interesting is that because you're using machine learning, you're able to say that these predictions would matter outside of your data. So you give me a new person who I haven't had a chance to ask them about their personality, nothing else. The predictions from my study should be just as good for that new person who I've had no chance to ask anything about their personality to. If you just give me their transaction data, I can tell you to some degree what their personality is. Now, these predictions are far from perfect. They're not. They're like a middling. They're like, okay. But the cool thing is that you don't need to just have someone's transactions. In theory, you could match this with, their census tract data or like any other kind of data, and then the predictions will get better. So when you start looking at data like this, I've got like millions of transactions, for thousands of people. Honestly, everything starts looking like a bit of a stereotype. Like what do extroverts, what predicts extroversion? It's like going to nightclubs and going to restaurants and going to parties and things like that. What predicts that someone's conscientious? They go to the gym and they spend money on stationery and So it's kind of interesting in some ways that I could come up with some like random examples of where a prediction mattered that you were surprised by, but in some ways it's sort of the real story is just that when you aggregate up giant amounts of data, kind of what you would expect to predict does predict.
Okay, so let me I just before, well, actually, let me go to you, Brandon, because I'm curious, if you're hearing this, and one thing that I'm hearing at least is you need millions of data points to be able to predict some of these findings, right? And and at the same time, Joe, you're also pointing out something that I don't think that we should make light of, which is that some of these predictions map onto the ways that we would think about it. If you're somebody who's, spending money at the bar, et cetera, going out to restaurants, maybe that is more related to being extroverted, and then we can go backward from there. So then maybe we could use some of this on a more individual level. And I'm saying this in a very speculative way. Brandon, I'm curious, what your reaction is to this. Does this resonate at all? Do you look at a client's spending history and make some inferences about their psychology, about their personality, or is that a territory you don't go into?
Well, in this context, no, it's not necessarily territory that we've gone into, because I think it's a little dangerous actually for people that aren't
Okay.
trained to start making personality assessments on how an individual is based on their spending. But I'll tell you where a lot of the advisors have used this is to see where it aligns with values, right? So
Okay.
I think what Joe has found aligns with what we've already known. So at least practically speaking, budgets don't work, right? Because you're telling people how much money they can spend, where they can spend it, and I'm thinking about that from a personality perspective or from a value perspective, we're shaping them into a box that they may not fit in, right? So I think like that is as true maybe for values as it is personality. I think where we've seen this is when somebody tells us what's important to them, and then we see their cash flow, and their cash flow isn't aligned with their values. And also, we can also see where their values are, right? Like I know, and because we've had dinner before, right? Like if I looked at your credit card statement, I might see that you go to a lot of concerts, or you at least try to go to a lot of concerts when you have time, because we've talked about that if I'm not a concert guy, like that's just because I'm not a concert guy. You spending more money on concerts than me doesn't make you
Right.
reckless with your money. It's just showing where you're.
Thank you.
Yeah, and make sure your wife listens to this. But doesn't mean that you're spending recklessly because you're spending money on concerts. It's where you value. People do this with food. People do this with vacations. People do this with a lot of different things. As Joe's talking though, if we're trained correctly, if there is some cheat code where it's like, yeah, some of this stuff points to this type of personality, I think that takes the ability to advise better to another level, right? And that's
Okay.
probably missing out there actually. Like I don't know that advisors are being trained around how to identify personality types, especially based off of spending. But we all have the spending data. So it would be training worth the time, because if we can fully understand a client's values and where their money and values are aligned, if we can just add personality to that, we're going to be so much better at our job. So much better at our job. But I don't know that a lot of us have thought in practitioner land, at least, around, wow, that's showing some personality differences.
Yeah. Yeah. Joe, how far away are we from that?
I'm not sure on I guess it kind of comes down to, is this something humans can do versus a digital robot? And I think that, I'm telling you that I can create an algorithm that
Right,
can,
right.
instantly do this prediction, and a human can interpret that. A
Sure.
human can say, oh, this person's profile is this, I'm going to interact with them this way. But at the same time, I guess one of the really exciting things about this is what it offers in terms of like hyper personalization. So if your bank starts offering this service where it can scrape all your data, come up with, what kind of adjectives should I use to talk to Hal? Like what kind of verbs does Hal respond to? What kind of images would match his personality? Then I think in that world, it's going to become more competitive and harder for a human to argue they can add value over that if this sort of digital world allows for a much stronger hyper-personalization than what's been done in the past.
All right, so I'll walk back from hyper personalization to just personalization, because you've got this is the final research topic of yours that I really love, this research on personality matched saving goals. Can you say a little bit more about that, what that term means? I mean, I think it's intuitive, but I'd love for you to sort of dig into it. And what are some examples, and how does that show up in your research?
Yeah, I mean, this is a nice segue, because kind of what I just described is what we were trying to do with this project. That, the cool thing about what we just talked about the prediction is the scale that in theory you could use this. Again, if I've got this algorithm and it's only for, say, a few thousand people, but it should be as good if the bank has 10 million customers. You should be able to apply this algorithm, and then for a whole 10 million customers, I can know what their personality is. So then what do we do with that? What do we do with all these predictions? Well, I think what would be the really cool thing to do would be to be able to use those predictions to make people better with their money, to make them, better off with their money. And one obvious way to try and do that is with savings. In general, people don't save enough. savings rates are too low, people are not saved enough for retirement. And so we worked again with a fintech app to try and work on this, to basically say, hey, what if we send people messages to save that are matched to their personality, in particular to the savings goal that we're trying to get people to do, is that matched to who they are? So for example, like someone who's very kind and warm and agreeable, one of the big 5 traits of agreeableness, like maybe the kind of message that would resonate more with them would be, you should save for your family, for your children's future, for for you to have these strong relationships moving forward. If you're extroverted, you love concerts, maybe saying you should save money to have the best time of your life in future, to not miss out on the best opportunities, etc. So that's what we did. I mean, because we were constrained by working with a specific field partner, these were actually people who were who had almost no savings. So these were people who basically had nothing, and we were trying to get them kind of to make their first savings goal, to reach an amount, and then it was basically like a kind of binary outcome of like, did they reach the savings goal or not? And we found that when we were able to match the messages we sent them to encourage them to save to their personality, they were 3.5 times more likely to reach their savings goal than the alternative. And what's really cool is that we compared this to the company's own messages that sent to encourage people to save. So even though the company had been working on this for years, like optimizing these messages with A/B testing, trying all these different ways to get people to engage more, like our personality matched approach, without any A/B testing, without any sort of refinement, was 3.5 times better. So I really do think that this is a very underutilized approach to getting people to change their financial behavior.
That's amazing. And I mean, Brandon, I know that many of your clients are not in that bucket of not having saved, but I'm wondering if, let's move from savings to investing and the types of investing you're doing and why you're doing it. Is this something you've ever thought about? Have you thought about trying to tailor the way that you make that ask?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, tell me more.
Not even so much around making the ask about an investment. I mean, everybody, regardless of their their net worth, has goals, and and many of them are ambitious. They're just ambitious relative to their net worth. I mean, we have clients that are hyper competitive, so you might simply make a statement like, I bet you can't save $500,000 this year. and that's enough. You have others that are they like data, right? Like they'll wear a Whoop or a Fitbit, and it's all about the streaks. And so then it's creating a mechanism to where, like, you're showing them, look, you've saved every month this amount, or you start talking to them the way they like to be talked to. And that's the customization personality, like towards their personality, that I think more advisors should be doing. But it's hard to do that if you work with 500 different clients, right?
Yeah, for sure.
It's hard to scale that, because it's hard to really know every client's personality if you work with that many different clients. But it's certainly helpful, and it certainly helps them get to where they've told you is important. You just have to figure out what it is that you need to get them, like how you get them to start moving in that direction. And sometimes it just takes, I don't want to call them tricks, but you help understand what gets them to move forward, and you play into that.
So, I mean, here's my hope. We marry your already advanced level, human insight, Brandon, with some of the techniques that Joe's using. And we eventually get to a point where we can just elevate the things that you're already doing. You said, it's so hard when I have 500 clients. All right, but what if we at some point can have, more of the algorithmic approach to personality detection, and what's the right thing, what's the right message there? Maybe you can do even better than you're doing now.
Yeah, well, just to jump in, I just think that humans are already really good at this. I think Brandon made that clear. I think that humans get that you wouldn't speak the same way to your grandmother as you would to your best friend. And so I think humans are kind of naturally good at this, but marketing departments aren't, and so if you're an advisor firm and you send out these monthly emails or weekly emails, like very often they're just one size fits all. And maybe like that's a particularly good place that we could try and improve, assuming that probably the financial advisors are already doing quite a lot of this sort of personalization because it's like natural to us. But on the messaging side, I don't think we're doing anywhere near enough of that.
All right, so I'm going to do a little rapid fire question for both of you. Joe, anything that you'd want Brandon or other advisors to know from the research side?
Anything I want to know? I mean, I guess, honestly, this is going to be a cop-out, but I feel like that we just don't know enough. Like, this is such a cool area to be in. We're still learning so much about what people are doing. And so every study I just described to you was with a collaboration between an academic and a company or a business. And so if you've got a question that you want to ask, like, think about whether you could get some, amazing free, often advice from an academic, create some of this knowledge, as a partnership. Because there's a million things we've learned, but like there's 10 million more to learn. And so I would just encourage people in this space to think about these academic collaborations in terms of answering the questions that are burning to you.
Okay. Now, Brandon, you now can kind of occupy both as a newly minted doctor. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Anything that you'd want Joe or me or other researchers to know from the set where you sit, sort of bridging practice and academic thought, anything you'd like to study more or dig into?
Yeah, I do want to acknowledge that I think there is some momentum in this space. The Financial Therapy Association and the work that's being done there, and a lot of people that are writing in that journal, they're starting to address this, right? Like, money is far more than just the numbers, the finance, the math of it, and there's a lot of researchers that are starting to look into that, but it's a field in its infancy, whereas a profession we're starting to become very mature. And but I think the one thing we've talked a lot today, and it's almost like we're talking to a person or a personality, but a lot of people we see are couples, and that adds a level of complexity because we aren't just dealing with one personality or one set of personality clusters. We're dealing with multiple. And as a baby researcher, I'm aware of how difficult it is to sometimes pull that out, especially when you're working with couples. And so I think that's an area that really needs to be looked at, if it's possible, is understanding the relational dynamics that go into not just working with one person, but working with a couple, because there's a lot of individual clients, but there's just as many coupled clients.
Just marrying what we've been talking about personality and couples. There's this great paper by Christina Nikolova and others where they look at couples and self-control, one trait that obviously relates to finances. And what they find is that in terms of people's financial outcomes, when you have a couple, the couple's outcomes look like whichever was the lowest partner's self-control. So basically, if you're the low self-control partner, you seem to be the one calling the shots or overspending or doing the bad stuff. It's not the couple's average together to get some sort of average level of self-control. So I think that, couples and personality, there's a lot of cool work to be done there. And it actually looks a bit scary right now that it seems to be the case that with couples, the sort of more damaging personality traits in terms of finances seem to be the ones that win out in a couple dynamic.
I love this because I think, and Joe, you've of course done some work on looking at couples together. There's other work by Scott Rick and Jenny Olson and others who we've had on the show, looking at different sort of levels of, are you a spendthrift or a tightwad? But there's so many different personality dimensions that haven't been examined in that sort of dynamic, interactive sense. And I think, Brandon, that calling that out is so important as a question for researchers to investigate. So I'm gonna pause there. I think this is in some ways opened up more questions than I think we could even begin to answer. But I just love this conversation. I think it's so important to consider what these different dimensions of personality are, how they intersect with financial decision making and advisor client interactions, and what can be picked up on and what can't be, and what will be picked up on later. So Brandon, Joe, thank you guys so much for being my guest today. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks.